All right, recording again. Okay, so before we talk about Renaissance architecture, I want to show you a few short videos about marquetry, about tapestry weaving, and also linear perspective. They're very important for this period of time. The videos will show you the marquetry and tapestry weaving that really is more like for applies to next week's subject of the French Baroque. But I think it's important to see them. So here, all right. Now, you can see this. So here, this is linear perspective.
According to Filippo Brunelleschi's biographer, he stood just inside the main doors of the Cathedral of Florence when he conducted his first perspectival experiment. And that's where we're standing right now.
We're very close to it. Brunelleschi's experiment demonstrated that linear perspective could produce an incredibly real
to follow, but highly accurate, that could translate the volumetric world that we move through time onto a frozen two-dimensional surface is really an extraordinary achievement. There's some discussion among scholars as to whether or not there was linear perspective in the ancient world, but if there was, it was lost. And linear perspective was created, at least for us, in the modern world by Brunelleschi in the 15th century, around 14.
By the way, this image that they're using of this Roman fresco, if you trace the angles of the edges that are receding, they don't really go to a unified point. Outside the frame here, there are some...
There's some discussion among...
Farther to the left, there are some parts of the architecture that are really going in the wrong direction. So the idea with linear perspective is that the angle of these edges that are receding, as they recede, when they go into the distance, they will reach a point where they converge at a point. And if you can control a drawing of three-dimensional space, especially architectural space, by establishing where that point is, which is at eye level, and in this case with one-point perspective, it is directly in front of the viewer. And then all of these edges that are receding will be going to that point, and it keeps the appearance of the interior organized to a single viewpoint.
Scholars as to whether or not
so the Romans
linear perspective in the ancient
came
world,
close, but they did not have
it was lost. And linear perspective was created, at least for us, in the modern world by Brunelleschi in the 15th century, around 1420.
Right, and so some people say that Brunelleschi rediscovered linear perspective in case the ancient Greeks and Romans had it before him.
Brunelleschi had gone to Rome and had studied antiquity, and some have hypothesized that he developed the basis for linear perspective in an attempt to be able to accurately portray the buildings that he was looking at, that he was sketching, that he was drawing.
It's certainly something that artists beginning really in the 1300s were creating forms. They were creating human figures that were three-dimensional by using modeling and making the figures bulky and monumental. Then you had the challenge of putting those figures within a believable space. Giotto and Duccio had kind of approximated that space and began to create a kind of earthly setting for their figures, but had not achieved perfect illusion of space for their figures to inhabit.
As the culture becomes increasingly analytical, mathematical, it's a trade-based culture. This is a culture that in some ways may have demanded of its artists a kind of precision, a kind of mathematical accuracy in its representation. And Brunelleschi delivers that. So what does he do?
Brunelleschi creates a perspectively accurate image of the baptistry and its surround.
Right. So Brunelleschi develops a system with just a few essential elements, and through these elements is able to construct accurate scientific one-point perspective. They include a vanishing point, which is at the viewer's horizon line, as well as a series of orthogonals or illusionistically receding diagonals. What Brunelleschi then does is he paints or draws an image of the baptistry with linear perspective and puts a small hole in the center of it. He takes that small drawing or painting, puts a handle on it, and holds it in front of his face, but facing away from him. He then takes a mirror and holds it in back of that. Now remember, his painting has a small hole in it, so he can see through it straight to the vanishing point.
So he's holding the mirror at arm's length and the actual painting with the hole in it right in front of him for his eye to look through.
Right. So you can see the painting's reflection in the mirror. And if he pulls the mirror away, he can see the actual baptistry. And he can bring the mirror back to see the painting, move the mirror away to see the actual baptistry, and see if, in fact, those lines are well coordinated. And it was a very convincing experiment.
What Brunelleschi saw in the reflection of the painting looked exactly like the reality that was in front of him.
This would have the most profound effect on the history of Western art. Virtually every painting in the Western tradition after the 15th century is responding to linear perspective, either adopting it or very consciously rejecting it.
You can see here the angles of the different sections of this plaza. They are going to a vanishing point right up here in this doorway.
It for some reason.
And within a couple of decades after Brunelleschi's discovery, Alberti, the brilliant architect and theoretician, writes a book called On Painting, in which he codifies Brunelleschi's discovery and creates a manual for artists of how to use linear perspective and how to make great paintings.
Okay, that's that, which I hope helps. Now here, so linear perspective is it's a methodology. If you if you haven't taken perspective and rendering, you're going to learn it. If you haven't already done it, we've done a little bit of it in Design 1, those of you who are taking that class. So I mentioned the technique of intarsia. And intarsia is an Italian form of marquetry. The term marquetry is French. And basically they are the same process. And I'm going to show you this short video of what marquetry is and how it's done. So there are still people who can do these old techniques, and in some cases they do them using the old tools, like old types of saws and old processes. So check this out.
Marquetry, or wood mosaics, are made by arranging hundreds of small, separately cut pieces of wood into an intricate design.
This is not a very high quality.
The process for making marquetry began when a craftsman drew, or more often traced, a design on paper. This drawing was then secured to a sheet of heavy brown paper. Following the lines of the drawing, the craftsman perforated the pattern. Although now made with a device similar to a sewing machine, during the 18th century, thousands of holes had to be laboriously punched by hand with a needle. This heavy sheet, called the pounce pattern, was laid on top of a sheet of white paper. The craftsman then rubbed graphite over the surface of the perforated pattern to transfer the design to the bottom sheet. The design could be reproduced several times using this method. The wood was then sliced into thin sheets called veneers. In the 1700s, skilled artisans using a cumbersome handheld saw could cut veneer as thin as 1 millimeter. Elaborate marquetry designs required dozens of types of wood, some chosen for their natural color, some for the interesting patterns in their grain. Others were dyed to produce vivid colors. Copies of the design were carefully cut into petals, leaves, and other elements. These small paper patterns were used as guides for cutting the veneer into hundreds of individual pieces. Multiple sheets of veneer were then nailed together into packets. Then, using animal glue, the patterns for the leaves and petals were affixed to the veneer packet. Having secured the packet in a special vise and cutting frame, The craftsman cut out the individual pieces using a jigsaw. This allowed him to make multiple copies of each piece. Hot sand was then poured over certain pieces to burn shadows, creating a sense of depth and movement in the composition. The numerous pieces were now ready to be assembled into the final design. Once the background had been cut out, it was glued onto another copy of the design. Each piece was laid face down. When all the pieces had been put together, the craftsman was ready to flip the assembled marquetry and glue it to a piece of furniture. The supporting paper design was then removed and the surface was cleaned. The marquetry was now complete and ready to decorate an object like this writing and toilette table.
Cool, huh? Takes a little bit of patience to do marquetry, so you can appreciate the degree of difficulty of that perspective in that Italian palace. Now, lastly, I want to show you this about tapestry weaving. And this is the tapestry weaving is from a French manufacturer this manufacturing was created. I guess this company or this studio was created by Louis XIV, and but it's really quite beautiful stuff, and it's very important to see how these things were made.
Tapestry weaving is a living art, and an art with a long history. To see a tapestry up close is to experience the hands-on nature of its making. The art of tapestry weaving reached new heights in France in the 17th century, when Louis XIV set up the Royal Tapestry Manufactory at the Gobelins, a place that still exists today in Paris. There, tradition still informs the making of contemporary art, knowledge and creative inspiration handed down at the exact same site.
It's enclosed, a bit beyond the reach of time. It can seem anachronistic in the world in which we live, when everything has to do with speed. Here, we take the time to do things with humanity and soul.
In Louis XIV's time, designing a tapestry began with a single artist who often planned an entire series and may have delivered early sketches. Other draftsmen honed the design. Today, similarly, a contemporary artist creates an original work with a tapestry in mind, but it's the weaver who interprets it.
A weaver needs to love drawing above all. You have to have a lot of imagination, and you have to be creative.
From a copy of the artist's work, the weaver has drawn essential lines onto strips of clear plastic. These are positioned against the loom's vertical warp threads, and the lines are redrawn. The markings in ink will serve as a visual guide for weaving. Next, the color palette is decided, and threads will be custom dyed to match the tapestry's design. The colored and textured threads of a tapestry form the weft. 17th century tapestries were made of wool for strength, silk for luminosity, and silver or gold thread for showing off a patron's wealth. Whether wool, silk, or some other material, weft must be dyed to have a color, and this requires a dye expert.
For me, you can't even call it a profession. I actually don't feel like I'm coming to work. It's really magical to see a color being born.
For hundreds of years, dyes came from plants, minerals, and insects ground into powder. The process of using them was challenging. Formulas differed depending upon the color and the material to be dyed. Temperatures for dye baths were tough to keep constant, with vats over wood fires. Now, chemical dyes are used. Infinite hues are possible using just red, yellow, and blue, carefully measured out. A bath of non-mineral water is heated. Dye is added. The weft soaks. Several hours later, the threads are pulled out and compared to the intended color. Adjustments might be made. More dye, longer soaking. When the color is perfect, the weft is hung to dry. In another area of the Gobelin, the dyed threads are wound onto spools for storage. When the weft is needed, it's transferred from a spool to the weaver's main tool, called a bobbin or broche. A bobbin can hold a single color or a combination of colorful threads twisted together. Now the weft is ready for the loom. In the 17th century, the production of large tapestries required huge looms. And at the Gobelin, there were two types, the horizontal and the vertical. Now it's the vertical loom. Thick strands of undyed wool, called the warp, form the structure of a tapestry, and on a vertical loom, they're especially noticeable. Before weaving begins, the loom is bare. The warp must be prepared according to the tapestry's specifications. In a process called warping, a single continuous thread is wound between a metal wheel and a wall railing to form loops. After a set number of loops, the process is repeated with a new warp thread. Each bundle of warp is braided. At the empty loom, the braided threads are arranged, perfectly spaced, across a wooden bar with metal teeth. The bar is hoisted up and suspended from the loom's top beam. The braids are undone and threads pulled down and attached to the lower beam. Once the warp is on the loom, the next step is to add tension. The warp is loosened and tightened until tension is just right. The last step is to add heddles, a system of looped twine attached to the warp, which will enable the weaver to move threads while weaving.
The weaver's role is that she does it all, from beginning to end. I speak from the point of view of the weaver, who invests a part of herself in the work.
A weaver sits behind a loom, facing the back of a tapestry. As she works, she occasionally looks between the warp threads to see the front of the tapestry reflected in a mirror. She also sees a reflection of the cartoon, a copy of the design being woven, which hangs on the wall behind her. When the mirror is turned just right, the reflection is aligned perfectly with the area being woven and the markings on the warp threads. The weaver's bobbin, or broche, is used like a needle to hold weft and guide it between the warp threads. Each one holds a particular color and hangs from the back of the tapestry, ready to be picked up and used again. The end of the bobbin is used to tamp down passages of weft. Or a metal comb is used. To make a tapestry, the weft is woven over and under the warp threads in a horizontal direction. A row from right to left is followed by a row left to right. Eventually, the warp will be completely covered by weft. To weave a passage, the weaver pulls on a heddle to uncross odd and even sets of warp threads. This brings one set forward, and in the space, or shed, between the warps, the bobbin can be guided through. To weave a narrow passage, using the heddles isn't always necessary. Like a harpist plucking strings, a weaver pulls a small group of warp threads forward. The weaver's skill and experience enable her to accomplish not only a complex design, but to create a textile that's structurally sound. Even today, a tapestry takes years to make. A finished tapestry is a celebration, honoring a work of art and the people who created it.
We are surrounded by history. We can't really speak of the spirit of the old weavers, but we acknowledge this glorious past and try to carry on ourselves.
All right. Interesting, isn't it? Would you like to be a weaver?
Yes.
I don't think I
Yes.
enjoy being a weaver, but I appreciate all the people who do the weaving.
Is it, I guess it's probably helpful to see what some of these techniques actually look like.
Yes, it is. But I had no clue that's what went into tapestries, so that was really cool to see.
Good. I mean, it does give you an appreciation for what goes into this, why tapestries are valuable. Also, intarsia and marquetry, they're very detailed and precious techniques, and not everyone can do them. It takes a lot of training to get to be good at some of these things. For myself, my Master of Fine Arts degree is in printmaking, and I make fine art etchings, woodcuts, and the etching process is really very much like it was. It hasn't changed significantly in centuries. We use some more updated equipment, but etching an image into a sheet of copper so that you can print from it is it's a nice archaic technique, and you can make some very sophisticated stuff with it. So I do have an appreciation for some of those old techniques. It doesn't, making an etching is not the same thing as making a tapestry, but it has a similar quality of being something that is, in terms of a viable, in terms of something that could be, I guess, common, a common way of reproducing an image or a common way of creating an image, like a woven image. Etching and tapestry weaving are, it's no longer the most efficient way to do it. At one time, it was the most efficient way to do it. There was no better way to do it. They didn't have the machines to do weaving some centuries ago. Okay. Well, we're going to next look at the Renaissance architecture. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, around this time, the 16th century, like in the mid 1500s, the printing press was invented in Europe, and the ability to print text, so movable type with cast type that could be reused. It allowed for the more rapid reproduction of books, and most people were illiterate. Maybe like 95 to 98% of the population of Europe at this time could not read. There was slowly, the literacy was slowly rising, but there was really no, not until the 19th century do you start to get more widespread education. And so, but still, the printing press allowed for more copies of the same book to be reproduced quickly. And so it did help the spread of information. So it was really kind of like the internet of its day. Okay, so with the Italian Renaissance architecture, we'll start with Gothic. This is the facade of an Italian Gothic church. Gorgeous. I love Italian Gothic. It's there's just a different, like, lighter quality to it. And here is some work by Giotto, and this is the sort of like almost perspective, similar to the Romans. He had some idea that these like roofs above angled downward, and then below the angles would go upward, but he did not have the system that Brunelleschi had. Now here, this is a Italian Gothic church. You can see this using the pointed arches. It doesn't have the ribbed vaulting. It's got this like more like a trestle structure for the roof. But here, Filippo Brunelleschi, ta-da, the guy who developed perspective. One reason why I wanted to show you that video is that it makes a little bit more sense of what this picture is, where he made the image of the baptistry of this building in Florence, and then he put the hole in the painting right where the vanishing point is, and then he had the mirror, and he holds it up, and he takes the mirror away, and he can see the building, and then he puts the mirror back, and he can see the drawing. So he had to demonstrate that it's a, it is more of a scientific method that you can follow the instructions and get, produce comparable results. So here is a drawing of his of the interior of the church San Spirito that he designed in the early 15th century. Here's an image of the church. And so here you have the, by comparison with the Italian Gothic church, you see the Roman arch, the curving arch is back, and you get these kind of like a riff on a Corinthian column. So I would call that a Corinthian column. And the ceiling, of course, you get the ceilings are different. It has this decorative ceiling, but it's also like the ceiling is flat. It's not the French and English Gothic had that ribbed sort of like vaultic, the pointed arch, those like the rib vaulting, which had the more like a pointed ceiling. Here, Santa Maria del Fiore, which is this dome, was designed by Brunelleschi, and it is really kind of like this breakthrough for the Renaissance, that this area of the church was destroyed by a lightning strike about 150 years before Brunelleschi figured out how to build that dome. But they built a model, back in the 13th century that had this big dome on it, and the problem is that nobody knew how to build the dome. They'd seen Rome, they knew that domes were possible, but it was wishful thinking, and it took 150 years of architects coming and going before Brunelleschi came along and figured out how to build it. So it's a pretty big dome. You see this, that is the largest masonry dome ever built. You can see all the little people up here, up on the at the base of the lantern or the cupola. And you can go up. There's an outer shell and an inner shell to the dome, and there's a stairway in between them. So you can when they let you can go up there. It's not always open. At this point, the dome. They're constantly reinforcing the dome. It's having a hard time. And here, so Brunelleschi was also an inventor. He invented this type of winch with a reverse gear to lift and lower blocks of masonry to build the dome. was a new type of winch that he had to design. Here is this gorgeous facade. This is the Gothic church. This is, so this is a Gothic church, and it has this Renaissance dome attached to it. You see that with some of the churches that are from the Renaissance era. They started out some of them started out as Romanesque churches. Then in the Gothic area, they got some renovation and updating with Gothic elements. And then the Renaissance comes along, and then they get Renaissance elements. But isn't that not a beautiful facade? It is. Now here you see the ribbed vaulting. So there are the Gothic elements. So that is because this is a Gothic, originally this is a Gothic church. As you go into it, though, there's the dome. This is the interior of the dome with the fresco going all the way up there. Here is God this is a Last Judgment, up and down, heaven and hell. Here is another building by Brunelleschi, the Hospital of the Innocents. You can see, again, Roman, curved arches, triangular pediments. Gotta just slap a cartouche up there too, why don't you? These little medallions with the little Amorini figure in it, and Corinthian capitals. And there you go. So in some cases they tried, like the Renaissance compared to Baroque, Renaissance tried to reproduce Roman, like the classical Roman and Greek architecture as closely as possible. Even though they were building different types of buildings. Still, when they were using these like visual elements, they made them as much like the Romans as they could. You have, let's go back to that, some clerestory windows up here. This is the raised section of the roof. And here is a facade. This is a good example of a Renaissance facade. This is a Christian building, a Christian church that that really is made to look like the facade of a Roman triumphal arch and or temple. So you see the great big triangular pediment, Roman arch, and these, I believe I mentioned the term pilaster, which is really this like rectangular, it looks kind of like a rectangular column, but it is part of a wall, and it's really more of a decorative element on the facade. It'll have a capital like a column, but it's not freestanding, and frequently it's not structurally necessary. So here is a comparison with the Arch of Constantine. So this lower part of this is very much like it's very, very Roman. Now here, by comparison, this is a Gothic church. Has the triangle, but it's not this flat. But the Renaissance church has this very flat triangular pediment. It really is just like a Roman facade. The fact that this is really an imitation of what they would have considered to be pagan architecture didn't really seem to bother anybody enough not to use it. I mean, there was a tradition of the Romans converting to Christianity, so maybe they were willing to let that slide. Now, check that out. They get bigger. The farther into the Renaissance era you go, the bigger the churches get, the more grand, just like the spectacular elements of Roman architecture. And you can see the transept here with the dome. So the big barrel vault, which is a Roman vault. And then here, the dome, this is the pendentive dome similar to the Hagia Sophia. There's the dome up here, but then there are these 4 arches it's sitting on top of, which allows you to get the dome up that much higher. There's a comparison with Brunelleschi's San Lorenzo. All right. There are also central plan churches where they use, this is a Byzantine church we looked at last time. Leonardo da Vinci, the Vitruvian Man. And Vitruvius was a Roman writer on, he wrote down a lot of the Greek, established a Greek, Greek and Roman classical orders. And Vitruvius's writings were rediscovered in this period of time. And so that had a lot to do with this reclamation of Rome and really classical ways of doing things. But Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, the center of the circle is the navel. And so this idea that, geometry figures into human proportions. And, this, similar to the Greeks, nature and geometry are not separate. They are part of one great big thing. So here is I guess it's a central plan of a church, which is really like a square and with these circles, almost like a clover leaf. So different types of churches are being built, different ways of applying geometry. So here, St. Peter's in Rome, which is the Pope's home church, and the whole this was designed over the course of 120 years, and so a lot of people were involved in it. So this is the Bramante plan of St. Peter's. And here, Michelangelo's dome of the interior of St. Peter's. Quite beautiful. Again, that pendentive dome structure with the dome up on arches. Here is a interior shot of this chapel area with some trompe l'oeil painting. A lot like this is illusionistic painting. This is all, there's no space here. This is the flat wall. You can see the pediment over this doorway is 3-dimensional, but a lot of this surface is illusionistically painted to make you think that there is depth there when there is not. All right, another architect who's important for this period of time is Palladio. This is the Via Rotonda by Palladio, which is possibly his most famous building. And it really is you can see there's this dome. It has similarities to the Pantheon with this Greek temple porch, and then in the center there is this dome. So again, it is using the part of this reclamation of the Greeks and the Romans. Which is, Not it's a shame. It would be nice to see it when it was first built because it looks a little poorly kept these days, at least from this photograph. And I kind of like this. Like it's almost a little trashy. The like sculpture all over the roof. Why not, right? Just keep tacking more decoration on it. This is Thomas Jefferson's, the home he designed, built with slave labor, by the way, but definitely referring to, he knew about Palladio, he knew about the Pantheon, certainly. And this cute little circular chapel, really, that is very classical in, like, you see the triglyph. This is like really like right off of a Greek temple. You got this big cartouche up here. Related a little bit possibly to this like round temple in the Roman Forum. This was for a long time referred to as the Temple of Vesta, of a Roman god. And then here we have this this elevation view of a Renaissance facade with all these. You see these Roman elements with triangular pediments, columns up on the like Roman pedestals, rusticated lower area with the Roman arches, and balustrades here. This introduction of the balustrade, like a little railing, like a little fence. This is more Renaissance than Roman. They did throw in some of their new stuff. So here's some vocabulary. Baluster is a short pillar or post, usually used as a decorative or ornamental element, and a balustrade is a railing made with balusters. And rustication, we've talked about the surface of stone architecture that is left rough or chiseled to create a worn appearance. And finally, printing. Printing is really important to this era. Images were printed, so woodcuts were there was a common way of creating an image to be printed along with a book because it could be made the same height as the type, as the metal type. So here's an example of printers at work. This guy is inking. There's like type set in here, and he's got these two like inking pads. And then here they would put the paper down and then press it, crank it, crank that lever, press the plate down, and then lift it, and then pull the press bed out, take the printed sheet out, put a clean sheet in, and then keep on going. It was previous to the printing press, reproducing a book had to be done by just writing it out multiple times. So scribes would, like in monasteries, you had like, a room full of monks writing out texts. And they would have a guy, like someone who was their teacher or someone who was leading this work, had the master copy and would read it, and they had to just write it out. These were sometimes familiar texts, and so, but if they made an error, they had to make a correction on the sheet, and they would write them out on vellum made from animal skin, which is much more valuable and precious than printing on paper. Paper is made from plant fiber and is it's a lot easier to make paper than it is to get vellum. All right, so here's a book, the Nuremberg Chronicle, which is this like history of the world up to 1493. And this is a hand-colored woodcut. And but just this, this is part of this printed book, which was really this history of the world according to the Christians in Europe. And it was a really important book for communicating consistent information to a broad range of people. And if it were written in, something that's written in Latin can be read by, a lot of different, I guess, people who knew, in the church especially. Latin was a scholarly language. This is written in German, which is I guess would have been maybe considered more vernacular. That it's just part of this maybe breaking away from the tradition that the language of nations wasn't as important as the language of the church. So anyway, so it's an illustrated text and it's all printed. This is a huge breakthrough. This, as I said, this is comparable to the internet, just changing. It changed a lot. Printing was something, it was a tool used, Martin Luther in leading, he didn't really set out to do this. He felt like it really seemed more like the church forced him into it. The Protestant Reformation, where he objected to practices of the church, and he ended up splitting off and creating his own form, I guess his own church within Christianity. And he used woodcuts to promote his message. Since most people were illiterate, he created woodcut images. He commissioned them that were clearly this, the imagery would have made it clear that they were against the Pope. So the whole issue was the Pope. The Pope is the leader of the church, and the Pope. I grew up Catholic. There was plenty of corruption, and that was what one of the things that Luther was opposed to. So
I was just wanted to add that Martin Luther was German, so maybe that's why, and especially he was face of the Protestant movement. And didn't they invent the printing press? Wasn't it in Northern Europe or Germany even?
Yes, it was in Germany. Gutenberg is credited with it, but he wasn't. Gutenberg was among several people who created printing, who had printing press operations going. Gutenberg ended up going bankrupt, and he didn't, but he's credited. He printed the Bible. And so the Gutenberg Bible sort of has become this almost iconic book of printing. But you're right, Luther was German, and so part of the argument with the church was that it should be in the language of the people, like he wanted the Bible printed in German, and people wanted to read the Bible for themselves in the Catholic tradition. You don't need to mess around with that. The clergy will read it and tell you what it says. And by the time I was in school, in Catholic school, we were reading the Bible. It's whatever, it's you can know these things. Yeah, but this is this is Latin. It's not as if Latin just disappeared, but it was important that books were printed in the language of the different nations, because then more people could read them. You could teach people to read German because they spoke German. and you could teach people to read French. They spoke French. Latin has this sort of like this veneer of exclusiveness, that it's only for the church.
Duffy,
Yes.
when I was young, I remember when church masses in the Roman Catholic Church were just held in Latin.
Yes.
Like they,
Yes.
you're there
missed it.
and your parents don't, even though they may know another language, they don't really even necessarily have been taken Latin, and then it switched over, and I think it really helped.
Well, I think it does. It makes it, it's not so remote. Yeah, and I think it is this. Well, I think it is part of a. It's a part of it. It is really like this happening in the 15th century, 16th century. It's part of a really like an intellectual shift, or even just like a, different people tried in the Middle Ages to create new areas within Christianity, and by and large, it was a good way to get yourself killed. Like you try to come up with some new idea for the church. It's like, with the ancient Egyptians, you wouldn't like go to the pharaoh and say, "Hey, I have a better idea." Like, no, you don't. Kill him. They didn't want to hear it. So it took, someone like, there was I think that there was some agreement, because Luther was not alone. And there were a lot of people where this, like, like one of the issues that sort of like, it's wrapped up, the history of the Christian church is all wrapped up in this. The Christian church was one of the greatest patrons of the arts and architecture. And we wouldn't have a lot of this stuff without the Christian church patronizing it and commissioning artists and architects to build this stuff. But one of the issues that people had with the church was the idea of indulgences. Does anyone know what an indulgence was? Or probably, I'm sure some people would grant you an indulgence if you paid them enough money.
Yes, it's basically they would forgive you your sins if you pay and you get a paper from church saying that you were forgiven by God, and that's what it was. Yeah, it was mostly, I think it was due to corruption amongst the clergy in church. And that's why the revolution, the Protestant Revolution happened, because people were fed up with it mostly. And also it kind of started like a little further off Rome, because most of the Protestants are in Northern Europe. They're not, because Rome then they retook the church, and they, with the Baroque, they really wanted to show how important the church is and things like that.
Yes. Next week we'll talk about the Counter-Reformation, which is the Roman Catholic Church coming back hard against the Reformation. But it is like the Reformation occurred in Northern Europe, so away from Rome. And, one of the things about Latin, I remember this from history class, when I was getting my bachelor's degree. In the Middle Ages, it was tough to find, especially at the early Middle Ages, it was kind of tough to find priests who knew Latin. Like they didn't have enough priests, and so in some cases there's evidence of priests who really didn't know Latin, and they just like, they would like go through the mass, go through the whole process of the mass, and just approximate something that sounded like Latin. They weren't really saying anything, which I think is kind of great. It's like Some guy had no idea what he was doing. But people get tired of this, and the idea of indulgences, where this idea of like there's heaven, there's hell, and then there's purgatory. And purgatory is like this like mid zone where you're not quite bad enough to go to hell, but you're not going to go straight to heaven. And so you got to go to this place that's like limbo for a period of time. And indulgences, if you gave money to the church and you got an official indulgence, it was time off of purgatory. As if a priest or a bishop could grant you that, they would decide instead of God being the ultimate authority there, which is very interesting. But this idea that that's just straight up corruption. I mean, what are you going to do? What can you say? It's very interesting to me. Having been raised Roman Catholic and not really being religious at all anymore. But really especially when you're talking about the history of Europe, the history of architecture especially, you have to talk about the church, because it had, you wouldn't have the churches without the church.
And not even that, like you mentioned, the church, because it was such a powerful and entity, and it had so much money. It was, before the sort of the middle class of merchants started to appear, the church was the only entity that could commission work. But after the Reformation, and because the Protestants did not believe in power of church, they believed in Bible and apostles and things like that. So the church wasn't there anymore to commission their work, the work of the artists, rather, in Northern Europe. And that's, I think, when we start seeing the emergence of the art market, much like we kind of see today, where works were not just commissioned, but they were painted and then sold to, not general public. Those were probably people that were a little bit more wealthy that could afford that kind of stuff. But
that's a very good point. You start to get like the Medici. The Medici were plenty corrupt themselves, but they were a secular client, and so they didn't have to. They didn't. They could pay for. They could get whatever they wanted as long as they could pay for it. And then in places where there was still patronage, but not quite as wealthy, it does change the quality of what you're the character of what you're getting. Not that it's lower quality, but there's a completely different sensibility in Northern Europe. Not as decorative, not as flashy, not as showy. And part of the flashiness, I'm sure, that comes with the church as the patron, is the church had just unlimited wealth. And so
I believe they had certain rules as to what they wanted and how they wanted to be portrayed.
Yes.
And the artist or the sculptor or whoever archetype, they had to adhere to those rules.
Yes, that was one of the things that held back changes in representation, or just how things some of the breakthroughs of the Renaissance came because it was just undeniable that they were able to do this much more sophisticated work. And so the preference for a symbolic image that was common in the Middle Ages gave way to this acceptance and even a preference for something that was more realistic. I mean, once Brunelleschi showed people linear perspective, once they were able to produce painting and sculpture and depict the figure the way the Greeks and the Romans could, then it was just like, oh yeah, that other stuff is bad. like if you look at the perspective of some of those other those medieval paintings, it's a joke by comparison. And contemporary painters of the 15th century and the 16th century, I guess, if you painted like they did in the Middle Ages, you were definitely out of date. So, there are a lot of factors that go into this. There are different ideas, like St. Francis of Assisi, who was, he was like late medieval age. His, when I've read, read some, scholarly work talking about him and the fact that he made a choice to, like, his expression of Christianity as a holy person was to emphasize what God has in common with humans, where you have the poverty, Jesus wasn't wealthy, so why is the church wealthy? St. Francis was successful because he came from a well-to-do family. He gave all of his stuff away at some point and just lived in poverty, and he was more emphasizing this connection with nature and connection with the world as opposed to the afterlife. But he never challenged the church. He never came out and said, well, the church is wrong, I'm right. If he'd done that, they would have killed him. The church let him coexist because he was also very popular. That idea of emphasizing humanity and this understanding of what it's like to be human from God, it shows up in the representation of the figure, where the figure of Jesus crucified starts to become more and more realistic, and so rather than this symbolic, flat figure, tacked up to a cross, there is suffering. There's the body slumping. There's blood. It's the wounds are made more and more realistic, and even just that idea that there was slowly this increased attention to the world we live in, and and there's disease. Let's try to cure disease rather than just try to do so rationally rather than just suffer. And so I guess the idea of suffering became less and less acceptable, even though it still happened. Well, it's all, to me, very, very, all very interesting. So attitudes change, ideas, so like this, and the attitudes, the attitudes have to change. You get new people paying for architecture and design, and so they drive it in a different direction. And slowly, and it does, and you do get like this, like with some of the artists become successful as artists, as individuals, not as a part of a guild or as trades, as someone who works a trade, which is really what in the Middle Ages, a painter was a tradesman, like a carpenter or a mason. A sculptor was basically a different form of a mason. They weren't artists in the sense that we have them now. But you're right, Elena, we do have this, in the Italian Renaissance is where you see it first start to happen, that the artists are celebrated on their own merits, and they can separate from the others. So they're not anonymous. Okay. Well, that's interesting, isn't it?
So fun. Yeah.
It's good stuff. There's a lot to know. We can, we're scratching the surface here, which is which is fine. We're really, what you're taking this class because this has there's a relationship between this stuff that happened in the past and what goes on right now. And I'll show you an example. Let me get my screen share back. Right there. So this is someone made a drawing in 2012 of an Italian Savonarola chair, and you can buy prints of it. You can buy it printed on acrylic, on metal, as a poster on paper, canvas print, greeting card. And if you want to, you can buy this chair come on. Let's look at the images and see that you can buy it from Walmart. So, there you go. $572 Savonarola chair through Walmart. What do you know? Oh, stop. So there's a replica of this chair from centuries ago, and maybe you're a church and you want something that has that that's got that classic ecclesiastical air about it. Savonarola, by the way, was a heretic. So he preached against the church and died for it. All right. I think that is enough for tonight. I'll send you a message when I have the next quiz ready for you. In the meantime, keep working on your vocabulary, the second vocabulary. And let me know if you have questions.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thank you, Duffy.
Thank you very much.
You are welcome.
Have a good week.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. See you next week.
Bye.
Thank you.